Hey Josh, Mr. Potato Head,
Canceled.
Dr. Seuss,
Canceled.
Mark Twain,
Canceled.
Kevin Hart,
Still canceled, probably.
Pierce Morgan.
Probably kind of canceled. Maybe shouldn't have been canceled, but it still was canceled.
I'm walking off at
There.
that point. How do Christians contribute and or perpetuate, and how should they step into this whole movement of cancel culture, or now cancel culture, right? Welcome to Kingdom Thinking, and today we're going to talk about hashtag cancel culture, hashtag cancel culture?
Yeah, dude. So this is awesome. Cancel culture is not a thing that's new to evangelicalism.
Say more.
Yeah, well, similar. So you didn't grow up in a youth group, right?
I did not.
Okay.
I didn't grow up in a Christian home.
Okay, so I grew up in a youth group that was in the early 2000s. Evangelicals got on this real big kick about taking Romans 12 super literally, right? Like be in the world but not of the world.
Okay.
And so we just decided that we were going to say like screw everything that was the world, right? In a lot of sense. So we had like these big parties where everybody would bring their like non-Christian music.
Wait, is this
and
for
we
real?
would microwave them. Yeah. This is a
not
real
a joke.
thing. No. I'm not even making. This is not even a slight exaggeration.
Okay.
And so we would have these like whole series based around this idea of like making sure that purity of mind meant that you could never listen to an Eminem song, or you could never listen to Tupac or Biggie or anything like that, or whatever. Even as far scaled over as like even Amy Grant would be questionable, right? Or like these other people that were like clearly Christian artists. And the whole goal was to like separate ourselves from culture and live these pure and godly lives. And so that meant that we could only listen to like terrible third wave ska music out of Orange County in the late 90s or whatever it was. Yeah. So Christians have perfected cancel culture.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So there's this meme here. Check this out. It says, "Isn't it funny that Christians who were burning Disney movies, boycotting Harry Potter, and speaking against all non-Christian music are now worried about being canceled?"
I got a Harry Potter book in 5th grade for a Secret Santa book exchange, and my parents wouldn't let me read it because we had just started a new job at a new mega evangelical church out here.
Yeah.
And the pastor did a whole series on why both Pokemon and Harry Potter were evil.
Oh, man.
I missed out on the whole Harry Potter phenomena
That's
because of one stinking dumb sermon. So frustrating.
Well, we got to talk about this.
Yeah.
How do Christians contribute and or perpetuate, and how should they step into this whole movement of cancel culture, or now cancel culture,
Yeah.
right? And so in a nutshell, what we understand this to mean is that in recent years, there's been an increasing movement and momentum in both social circles and academic circles to delineate the boundaries for what's acceptable literature.
Yeah.
What's acceptable on a podcast? What's acceptable in a movie? What's acceptable in a show? And even what's acceptable, I would say, on your own time, like
Sure.
to wear or to say.
Sure.
Right? And so when these things start to fall beyond the limits of these, then there seems to be a movement where shows, podcasts, movies, whatever the case may be, there's pressure to not converse and dialogue about, hey, would you consider this? But no, saying we're going to move you out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
So how should Christians respond to that? And should Christians be afraid of being canceled themselves?
Sure.
So let's jump into that. Now, Josh, you grew up in the Philippines, right?
Yep.
Basketball and soccer are pretty popular in the
Yeah,
Philippines.
huge, man.
One example that came to my mind when I was thinking about this is the whole idea of cancel culture, hashtag, or cancel culture, right? The counter to that. It seems like a pickup game where somebody says, all right, I'm going to go home and take my ball with me.
Yeah, dude, for sure. I did that plenty of times as a kid in the Philippines.
And so the illustration being the utter unwillingness to continue, to just stop completely and say, I'm done, I'm out.
Right.
And so is that helpful? What things warrant that response? What things don't? And again, how should Christians respond to that? So one of the things that's really interesting to me as we jump into this is I think the media has really perpetuated and fueled a lot of this movement, in the sense that with big and recent social phenomenons, all of a sudden it feels like everybody has to be an expert on these social issues,
on
right?
everything.
So
Yeah.
we've had really unfortunate circumstances with the George Floyd situation that led to uprisings, protests, and showings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the pandemic, obviously, and masks, and then vaccines. And it just feels like everything snowballed. And now you have interviews. The one I just saw was with Jürgen Klopp.
Mm-hmm.
He's the manager, the coach for Liverpool Football Club, right? World champion, like coach club.
Great at
Amazing.
soccer.
Exactly.
Yep.
And this dude is asking him like, hey, so what do you think about like coming back and the vaccines and the masks? And I really appreciated his answer because he's like, you're asking me to give you an expert answer on something I'm clearly not an expert at.
Yep.
And so it's this kind of like damned if I do, damned if I don't situation.
sure.
But I really appreciated his take on it because it got me thinking. I think part of the problem is all of a sudden, like the CEO for Big Five or the manager at Walmart or like whatever the case may be, all of a sudden we're asking that person to speak with precision and nuance and intelligence into an issue that they've never had to do so before.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that fuels the fire of saying, yeah, we're going to cancel that person and fall in line or else kind of thing.
Yeah.
So as we kind of jumped into these issues jokingly, right, with Mr. Potato Head and what it looks like for the future of gender-neutral toys,
Sure.
and or literature, Mark Twain, Dr. Seuss, the literary canon. Some of the issues I want to talk about today are, one, by whose standards should the past be judged? Two, if something is wrong, does it begin to be wrong when the current society recognizes that? Or was it always wrong on the basis of some independent standard? And three, what about things that weren't seen as wrong but are now seen as wrong?
Yeah.
So I want to hear your thoughts a little bit more about those specific examples we talked about, and then I want to gear the conversation towards how Christians can resist the temptation to just take their ball and go home.
Sure. Yeah. So the Mr. Potato Head is an interesting one to me. It's like the one that I like missed like the quickest because it just felt like it kind of came and went from Hasbro.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just seemed like actually a good idea to
Really?
me, right? Like give him a mustache and then give him a dress or whatever they were going to put in the same thing. It just seems an efficient way to sell a toy to me. So like it didn't really bother me too much on any like emotional level.
Okay.
People, dude, I watched a whole video where this guy like started freaking the crap out over people like not getting up in arms about Hasbro, like calling Hasbro people like really offensive slurs. It's just like, dude, like I don't know where that
It's not that
energy
intense.
was coming from. The Dr. Seuss one, I actually don't think is a real good example of cancel culture because like it was his private estate who decided to pull it back, on the offensive stereotypes, and it's what they were. They were stereotypes. Like it just kind of is what it is. They might say like it has its place in time, or it doesn't actually have any real effect on people, and like that's fine. I don't really know how you measure those, right? And like from some type of sociological position, but it was his estate that pulled the books,
right? Meaning it wasn't
pressure from the left,
press,
right? Like
gotcha.
Amazon didn't go like, we're not, hey guys, we're not going to publish like Mulberry Street anymore, right? Like that's not, so it's just like whatever. Mark Twain and the use of the N-word in his books. Now this one is really interesting to me because I think this speaks to like a bigger conversation, even the one that we had with Egypt a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
So here's what I would do something like that, right? Like Mark Twain as it relates to Huckleberry Finn, right?
Okay.
I would say like you leave the books as they are and you do like a beginning conversation at the start of this book experience where you're going to have the conversation in class and be like, look, this was the historical reality when this book came about, and this is why that's bad, right? And like this is why, and so put a disclaimer on it because what that does is that opens up the mind and the conversation to a better, more nuanced understanding of America's past.
Rather than coercion or erasure.
Yeah. And then the Western canon, which, many people may not really know, but it's like a conglomeration of like the most prolific and influential authors in Western literature.
Right.
It was put together in the 90s, wasn't it?
Classical texts, right? When you think of classic American literature.
Yeah.
And
so it's 26 authors. 4 of them are women. All of them are white. White men. Yeah. And so this to me is incredibly problematic.
Okay.
Because if you're not putting people in there like Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., like those are just 2 people that have prolifically shaped American history as much, if not more, than anybody else, right? In a lot of these conversations. Those would be easy additions to the Western canon, as it were. So that is problematic to me. And that I don't want to cancel it. I think you should change it, right? Like make it better there because I think the Western canon is still, I think Western civilization has some good things and has contributed some good betterment to the world and humanity as a whole, along with the whole issue of problems. So don't cancel me, people, relax there. But the idea here being like things can be updated and made better. And this is something that should be updated and made very much better.
Good.
Kevin Hart and his stuff from 10 years ago, I don't know. I always kind of go back and forth on this one. Like, the dude didn't really apologize, but he kind of apologized, but then kind of didn't at the same time, and was pretty defiant about this. I had so, it's like, I deleted my Twitter, I think, as a result of, like, when I would go back and be like, oh, I'm pretty sure I said some stupid stuff at a certain point that would have gotten me in trouble. And so it's like, it's weird for me to try and come after someone for something that they said 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But, it's like, his response wasn't very helpful to his cause in any of those things. But, if we live by that motto,
right,
dude, everybody's screwed.
And so that's the point, though, right? And,
yeah.
and I think that's the perspective I want to highlight as we analyze. So as a Christian who has persuasions, who isn't completely neutral on some of these things, how do I resist the temptation to, all right, I'm just going to take my ball and go home, and rather actually counteract what seems to be such a pervasive deformation of dialogue and discourse, and rather contribute to it. So I think the first important thing that you highlighted is not everything needs to be overhauled. Right. Things can be redeemed, updated, or restored.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's significant. So I don't think that fixes the problem. I don't think that can be applied to everything in the same way.
Yeah, for sure.
So
So that's an answer, right?
Yes,
that's the first answer.
Exactly. So
that would be
I don't think we need to stop teaching classic Western literature in schools and universities.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be a good thing for major universities to stop teaching literature.
Yeah.
That would not be helpful.
Even if it was written by a white guy.
See, and that's right. That's what I'm saying. Now, how do you mediate or mitigate the issue of, but now we're incredibly one-sided or anemic and ignorant of all these other social and cultural issues that we're going. So add more literature.
Yeah, or just teach black authors only for the next 100 years. White literature will still make its way in there. Like, we're the dominant race in America by 70% or whatever it is. It's just like, we'll find white literature will always be out there. People can seek it out. Like, if you just even...
Like, people aren't going to stop reading.
Send the pendulum as hard as you want in the other direction for that kind of stuff for a while.
Exactly.
And it'll still, it'll be fine. It'll be fine.
People aren't going to stop reading Mark Twain.
No.
George Orwell.
It's good. Those are great
John
authors.
Steinbeck.
Yeah, great authors there. Tom Clancy. I don't know if that counts.
Probably not.
But
so there seems to be a more moderate, reasonable way to alleviate the pressure of, like,
there's a way to have this conversation without succumbing to wokeism.
Exactly.
Right. And just the ridiculousness that is that, right, on its face.
Now, white supremacy manifestos.
Sure.
I think there's reason to think that might not be worth dignifying with a response.
Yeah, I mean, the Overton window has to stop somewhere,
right?
And so if you don't know what the Overton window is, it's kind of like what's societally deemed as, like, acceptable, right? Overton was a journalist, and the idea here was, like, if it's within the Overton window, it's something that's within the realm of good to talk about, right? And so, an interesting example in this discussion is, like, Amazon pulled the book When Harry Became Sally, which is a controversial transgender response to kind of the movement happening right now. But what's interesting
Harry
is
become Sally.
Yeah. So eBay pulled it as well, so you couldn't sell it on eBay or those kind of. Or I'm sorry, Dr. Seuss's books were pulled from eBay. You couldn't sell it there, but you could still get Mein Kampf on eBay, right? And so it's like, there's probably a conversation to be had there about something being off in the scales of cosmic justice for Dr. Seuss or whatever. But and but as a private company, they can do that. And this is where the other line is straddled a lot. Like, private companies doing what private companies want to do.
The free market.
Based on what they think is good for their business, which is a lot of pandering to social movements. And probably not genuinely heartfelt and good for their bottom line, versus, like, the actual societal change that needs to happen from a structural level.
Right. And so there's economic and political consequences to all that, which we will address in our future episodes, kind of unraveling a little bit more about this. The scope for today specifically, I think, is, so what do we do then? Because it seems that as Christians, you can either stand up for yourself and say, like, well, no, we're going to cancel culture. Yeah. And we're just going to go to, what is it called? Parler? Or
yeah, Parler was one.
Is that what it's called?
I mean, I don't think it's available anymore. I think AWS killed it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we're just going to go do our own thing, right? Or we're going to succumb to it because there's enough good happening.
Yeah, engage.
Exactly.
Yeah, so let me ask you that question. Whose standards should the past be judged by?
So, I mean, this is real tricky, right?
Yeah.
Because Christians have have skin in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. We do.
Crusades.
Yeah. Like you whispered that like the internet's not going to hear it if you said
Inquisition.
Yeah.
Slave trade.
Yeah.
Like we have skin in the game to answer the question. Now hold on.
Yeah.
Were these always wrong? Because you want to say yes. Well, if that's the case, then how do we explain such an egregious? Oh, they didn't see it wrong at that time.
Right.
That is really, really hard. And like I'm not going to sidestep it. That's just a really hard.
And this
question
is
to answer.
Really hard for a lot of like conservative evangelicals too, right? Because the idea here is like revelation stops within the finishing of the canon there, and so it's like revelation within the canon is like, hey, slavery's fine there, in the sense of like nobody ever speaks out. In fact, if you're going to be a slave, be a good one, in this kind of idea. Now, there's different forms of slavery that existed in the ancient Near East. That's not necessarily as prevalent like what it was in America, but that's a little bit of a cop-out answer. Like slavery was still very brutal in the first century. It was still terrible, still not good, still awful, and those types of things. So you either have to say like, well, the church has got it wrong for over 1,800 years.
For a long time.
There until William Wilberforce in the West decided to like get that out there, or progressive revelation happens, or there is some type of conversation between us and the text and interpretive differences occur.
Exactly. All that to say that in this movement where there is such a propensity to say, nope, disengage.
Yeah.
You're done, or I'm done. We want to encourage helpful dialogue and helpful analysis that's saying, hey, with this first question, by whose standards should we judge the past? Well, you really only have two options, right? The option is either you think there are independent standards, and so from the Christian faith, we would say that God himself is the independent standard from which we understand morality or ethics, right?
Yeah.
So that's always been there. Or if you come at it from not necessarily a faith presupposition, right and wrong is the result of a collective conscience of a community standard, right?
Yeah, and even to throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in there, it's like the revelation of God still has to hit the minds of humans, right? So there is a human in a component that will always be a part of divine revelation and the reception of that.
Absolutely.
So collective conscience, even in the latter one, still applies to the former faith-based community as
Correct.
well. And you got to be honest about that, because like otherwise we just set ourselves up to really get blindsided by, truth.
Correct. And so those are not as rigid as we think. However,
Certainly.
I do think it's important to point out the philosophical distinction between
yeah, for sure.
the what's the source of morality?
Yeah.
Is it our interaction, or is there something else?
Yeah, something outside of us.
Exactly.
Yeah, no doubt.
Exactly. And then question number 2, if something is wrong, does it begin to be wrong when a current society recognizes it, or is it on the basis of some timeless standard? Well, kind of related to that question, right? If from a faith perspective, there is an independent being from whose character flows human flourishing, human dignity, etc., then that was always the case.
Yep.
So we'd have to say, Christian tradition can be wrong.
Yeah, for
It
sure.
was wrong about the Crusades. It was wrong about slavery, right? And that's a hard pill to swallow, particularly with implications about what does that mean for American history.
Sure.
Nonetheless, I think you have to bite the bullet.
Yeah.
Unless you want to say, nope, it began to be wrong. And then that's a set of other problems.
Right, but at the very least, we have to say, like, this should cause you, as the Christian viewer, as the person watching this, right? Like, the idea is, like, we have to be super humble about this and be willing to challenge all of our suppositions, right? Because, dude, like, even interracial marriage was wrong.
Exactly.
Like, my wife and I wouldn't be allowed to be married
like
there. And so
50,
it's like,
60 years
yeah,
ago.
and like, but my dad was still alive, when
That's right.
you couldn't marry somebody who was a different color than you. And so it's like, all of our suppositions have to be challengeable, right? And
that's
that kind
exactly
of thing. We
right.
have to hold them loosely.
That's exactly right. And so what my proposal is that in the midst of such a polarizing, such a combative instinct and propensity in this movement, that Christians can actually bring healing and bring wisdom and courage into that conversation by, one, like James says, hey, be quick to listen,
Yes.
slow to speak.
So good.
I mean, how much of a difference would that make?
I don't know if it would solve all the problems, but I think it would solve at least 50% of them.
But just think about the attitude of saying, hey, I don't need to take my ball home. Okay, let's stop. Can you tell me why you think that way?
Yeah, why is it important for you to cancel whatever?
And I mean, even thinking about the distinction between being offended and something being offensive.
Sure.
Those aren't always the same thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, again, the Christian disposition to be willing to say, hey, maybe I was wrong about that.
Mm-hmm.
Can you help me understand why you think that was inappropriate? And then would you be willing to grant me the same grace and respect, or want to include my perspective on that? Like that would be such a huge game changer.
Yeah, because that's an interesting. So I've got a real life example for that, right? Like I have a friend who had to pay for some stuff, and they felt like they were being kind of gouged on something, right? And this friend, it just happens to be black, and there was a part of that conversation when he and I were talking about like feeling maybe there was a racial component to that. And my initial thought is like, what are you talking about? And like, you did something, you got to pay for it. You know, it's a thing. And there's nothing in me that goes, oh, the black experience is probably different than the white one on some of these issues. So maybe there's a different
At
component
least not
there.
instinctually.
Yeah. And so it's like, if I can be wrong about something like that, or blinded, right? Have a blind spot in something like that. Of course, it can apply to a myriad of things that I may not think are offensive, but could very well be.
Exactly.
And that's fine.
That's exactly right.
That's how we grow.
Right. And so as we kind of wrap it up here, in such a polarizing movement of, it's almost like cancel or be canceled.
Yeah, for sure.
So
or cancel yourself to get ahead of it, right?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So if you cancel culture, then you win.
Yeah.
So some pastoral conclusions for how this might actually work itself out in churches. Number one, how can Christian churches combat the instinct to categorize people in us versus them?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly important, and I think this all stems from how you read the scriptures. And so I think this is the correct way to read the scriptures. Anytime we have a conversation about what Christians are doing in the Bible, it always looks like defending the marginalized. It always looks like erring on the side of people who are not receiving justice, who are oppressed either historically or, contemporarily speaking. And so for me, the posture that we walk into any of these conversations, right, ranging from reparations for black people who may not have even been descendants of slaves, right? Like that's a huge thing in a lot of like conservative evangelical circles, right?
Okay.
Or the LGBTQIA plus community. Like if we don't enter into this with the posture of humility, hands open, palms up, right? Like ready to receive whatever's given there, and not be a defensive when the arrows and slings start being lobbied at church people. When you look at the totality of American Christian history, and it's not been stellar in this country, right? From the way that we've treated black people, from the way that we've treated minorities, from the way that we treated gay people in the 80s and 90s during the AIDS epidemic. Like, there has been so much failure on the part of the church time and time again to treat these people well, that if we don't respond well in this cultural shift and movement, there will be a schism that is far too inseparable for us without some type of supernatural interaction.
Okay. So I agree with that. The way that I think of it in my head is when you think of David and Goliath, or the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and Pharaoh. Isn't it interesting that when we read those, we identify as the heroes?
Always.
So when we preach from 1 Samuel 16, David, Goliath.
What are the Goliaths in your life that you need to slay?
Because you're David, right?
Certainly.
So my point being this. We're God's enemies in those narratives. We're the cowering Israelites.
Interesting. Okay.
In that narrative. We are the hard-hearted, ungrateful covenant breakers in the Exodus, not the ones who wield the sword.
Yeah.
And so how do we combat this us versus them? Well, we are all of them meaning the ones who need to be restored and redeemed, meaning the ones who are in desperate need of,
preacher.
God's wisdom and courage. And so, I think, we need to get excited about the reality that is we're no better than anyone out there who is trading traditional Christian faith for whatever, some progressive agenda.
Sure.
Guess what? We're just as pagan when we latch our religious beliefs to some other economic or political agenda.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the idolatry, the heart disposition to say, I get to sit at the table, not you, that one is for all of us.
Yeah.
And I really feel passionate about that. And I think that immediately changes the paradigm for, it's not about cancel or be canceled. It's about how, on a human level, how do we begin the discussion? Yeah. In a winsome way to say, hey, there is healing, there is truth. You don't forfeit or apologize for that, but you do it in a way where it's not with a sword.
Yeah, and Jesus, John 1, right? Jesus came speaking grace and truth.
Yeah.
And like we're super good at the truth part as Christians, but we often really suck at the grace part.
Right. And then lastly, should Christians actually be afraid of being canceled?
No. Look, man, if you're doing your Christianity right, somebody's going to get pissed at you somewhere down the line. Like there's no way to get around it. And
Right.
they should. They
Yes.
should, because Christianity is offensive by a lot of modern
Yes.
sensibilities
Yeah.
there. And so it's like, it sucks, right,
Yeah.
dude? It's cost me friendships there because there's things I'm not willing to do or
Might
things I'm not
cost you
willing to
your
budge
job,
on.
maybe?
There, yeah, dude. I mean, I happen to work as a pastor there, so I might get away with that one. Don't fire me, Andrew, if you're watching this. So it's like, yeah, I mean, that could happen.
Right. And that's exactly right. Now, you say it so casually, right? But for our viewers, the power and the wisdom that is so of the gospel that is so counterintuitive to the way of this world, if you really believe that, then there isn't a podcast, a show, a job that you're going to depend on for sustenance.
Right.
And I mean, we should kind of be embarrassed, right, of what we think persecution is.
Dude.
Because we have Christian brothers and sisters
Yeah.
in lots of parts of the world that are literally being imprisoned, tortured, and killed for their faith.
100%.
And so should Christians be afraid of being canceled? No. See, because cancellation doesn't threaten our identity. It doesn't threaten who we are.
Right.
Who we are is actually much more powerful and transcendent than what's going on here.
Yeah, and we don't want to minimize like the real life consequences of that, right? Like it can be difficult. You're right.
Correct.
We shouldn't be flippant in the dismissal of those types of things. There, but it's like the gospel's foolishness to those who are perishing. Take up your cross and then take up your cross daily.
Exactly.
In Luke, right? So it's like Jesus, like in Mark, yeah, you better be ready to physically die for this, maybe
physically be canceled.
Yeah, or spiritually on the day-to-day basis of being marginalized by society.
And if
like,
that's the case, then you can have courage, wisdom, grace, and patience to say, all right, I'm not going to take my ball
and every time
go.
Christianity gets marginalized, it booms.
Exactly.
Right? So it's like, okay, dude, all right, great.
All right.
People will come to know Jesus.
Good.
Yeah.
So I think this is a helpful, fundamental posture from which to begin the conversation.
Problem solved.
There you go, right? Thank you guys for tuning in. What we're going to do in the next few episodes is discuss what might be some implications economically, politically for Christians with some of these things.
Yeah, for sure.
So leave us a comment. What do you think about what we proposed here as a fundamental starting point to engage with cancel or be canceled? We'll see you next time, and thanks for tuning in to Kingdom Thinking.